reality. One God, one life, one way, one reality. Welcome to In Search for Truth. We are talking about the Noahide Laws. I hope you are joining us. And if you are, we thank you for listening. Today we are actually going to speak about the positive aspect of the laws. Many times when people hear the word law, they think of something that's totally restricting them from doing anything that they would like to do, or for the sake of keeping safety only, and things like that. They don't actually look at a law as a means of growing, trying to learn something from it. So without further ado, y'all remember Jack, and we will begin.
Well, as we had discussed, the last couple of weeks, that most of the time when we do hear the word law, we automatically think about something that just restrains us. But I think you brought up in one of the discussions about, I think you used the words active and proactive or something of that nature.
Proactive and reactive.
Proactive and reactive. Yeah. But, when we talk about the 7 laws, Sheva Mitzvot Bnai Noach, which are the 7 laws that are given to the nations, most of the time we talk about those in terms of being laws for society, or societal laws, that allows societies to have a healthy society. In other words, a society doesn't have laws that prevents murder and illicit sex, adultery and so forth, or laws that prevent theft. Well, eventually society cannot exist. In other words, it's going to fade into non-existence. So when we look at the 7 laws, we think about them in some sense as laws that benefit society, but we also have to think about the fact that society itself is made up of individuals. So what benefit does the individual receive from keeping these laws? Well, the first benefit is kind of obvious. You're in a society where you can actually, in some sense, exercise your religious freedom, much like the document that was founded by our forefathers here in America. They actually realized that government was to do one thing and kind of one thing only, and that was to provide a place, a safe haven, I guess, for lack of a better word, where you could actually exercise your inalienable rights. Now, they realized that government couldn't, there were certain rights that were given to us, and they named off basically 3 of them. And that's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, and they said among those inalienable rights. In other words, that doesn't limit, that we just say there's only 3, but among those inalienable rights he talks about in the document, the Constitution. And so they're not limited to just those 3. In other words, there's many other rights that we would have that are God-given rights, inalienable. In other words, the government can't give us certain rights. So what the government is supposed to do is to create a society where individuals can exercise their inalienable rights, in other words, their God-given rights. So when we talk about the 7 laws, we talk about the laws in the sense of a societal type law, but then what is the benefit to the individual? Well, the obvious, one of the first benefits is that there's no fear of being murdered, and there's no fear of people stealing from you, no fear of someone committing adultery with your wife and so forth and so on. But what does that do for the individual that's actually practicing these laws? And then the next question is, what about when we start looking at these laws? And I always, there's a couple of different lists when you go to the Talmud to look at the list. But I've always had my own way of understanding those. So I diverged just a little bit from those lists. And it's a nice way of remembering those. And so it's kind of like remember the 10, right? So the first 2 I put in the category of man's relationship with God. Don't commit adultery. Don't commit idolatry. And the prohibition against blasphemy, right? And then I I go to the prohibition against murder, which I see as the greatest one. The prohibition against sexual immorality, which I kind of connect with that one. And the prohibition against theft, right? And then, as we come on down the line, then of course we have the prohibition against eating the limb of a living animal. And of course then we have the prohibition against setting up, it's really a prohibition against injustice, but we make it a positive to say that we have to have courts of justice. So we all benefit as a society at large, in some sense, from those. But then, what kind? And I'm going to use this word. Let me explain this word. When I use the word perfection, it's needless to say that we're never going to reach the place of being perfect.
Right.
Right. So when I use that word perfection, I'd like for people to understand that we're working toward perfection. Does that mean we're ever going to gain to be a perfect, human being?
You're saying a continual perfection of the self.
Exactly, continual perfection.
Not a reached goal.
Right.
Not an arrived at goal.
Right. It's not. It's something that you continuously strive for, knowing at the same time that you're never actually going to reach that.
Right.
Right. So it's an effort on our part to continually working toward the perfection that God wants all human beings to be. When we use the word Adam, for example, Adam, which is the first man, Adam came into this world in a state of what we call innocence, not in a state of perfection. He could have evolved into that perfect man, but he failed to, as we know. But sometimes throughout the Tanakh, you will have this word Adam that is used to represent the perfected individual, the truly perfected individual, which we are all striving to do. In Hebrew terms, by the way, it's called tikkun olam, rectification. So we all have a job, we all have a task, not only to rectify ourselves, but in rectifying ourselves, we're also taking part in the bigger picture, and that's the rectification of the world. In other words, we started out in the Garden of Eden, and we ultimately, hopefully, get back to the Garden of Eden. So it's a constantly striving for the ultimate perfection.
Right.
And so this is not only the people of Israel's part, but it's every human being's part, that we're actually working toward this as a goal, steadily. If you look at secular history, I call it secular history kind of runs linear. In other words, they have a starting point, but there's no end goal. There's, it's just going until it ends, or whatever happens to happen. It's kind of que sera, que sera, the old song, whatever will be, whatever it will be. But within Jewish history, Torah history has a starting point, but it also has an ending point. It's secular. It's not running linear. It's a secular history. In other words, mankind starts in the Garden of Eden, and where's his end point? Back to the Garden of Eden. So every individual is working toward perfection as an individual, but at the same time he's also working toward the reconciling of the world, tikkun olam, to bring correction, so that everyone eventually winds back up in the garden.
So what you're saying is that it's every man's duty to try their best to arrive at that level, whether they make it or not.
Exactly.
It's their duty to progress in life and try to make that rectification in their lives, which will eventually make it to the rest of their surrounding.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, I heard of a conversation once that said, I don't think about the things I don't know because I only deal with how I'm being dealt with. And it was almost a way of excusing any recognition of God, any recognition of doing good by others, because they would just deal with people as they were dealt with by those people. So in other words, they were just saying, I'm just going to live by the seat of my pants. I'm not really going to make an effort to do good by anybody else because nobody really does for me. And it's sad that there are people who probably think that way. That's the old saying, embodied, in my opinion, the old saying that says, well, nobody will ever, or that'll never happen, or nobody will ever do that, when it comes to doing right. And this is what he's saying, is that, Adam, us, we're supposed to try to achieve that level of perfecting ourselves so that we not only do good for ourselves in a positive way, but the rest of the world. And that's what generates that reconciling of the world, that correction of the world. But everybody wants a supernatural event to do it for them. They don't want to take action into it.
That's the real issue. When you study the Tanakh puts the responsibility on the individual. It's not what I believe, right? It's what I'm doing. In other words, I have to be concerned, okay, maybe I don't believe exactly the way I should do, but the important part is, what am I doing?
Right.
Right? What am I doing? So we have to look at from the fact that, okay, by the way, I'm not saying it's not important that you have specific beliefs.
Right.
You should have those, and you should have really true ideas and true concepts of God. That's a good place to start. But the most important thing is what am I doing? Am I striving to better myself and to better individuals without taking away from the other individual? And what you said is very true, because Eob in the book of Job, he brings up this subject about pleasing God. And what he does say is, he says, if you're righteous, in other words, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, who does that affect? Well, it doesn't affect God. It doesn't change him in one way or the other, because God's unchangeable. But it does affect me, and of course it will affect you if I'm living a righteous life, and the people around me.
Right.
On the other hand, if I'm living a wicked, evil life, it does exactly the same thing, of course in a negative way.
Right, it still affects us.
It still affects us in some way. So we, at least looking at the Torah, the Tanakh, we are taught to understand that we all have an ultimate goal, and that's perfection of the individual. And if every individual perfects itself to its ability, then we live within a perfected society, right? And that really is, if you want to use the word heaven, that is really heaven, right? Because then you have a perfected society. I've often said if people would just keep 3 of the laws: don't kill, don't steal, and don't commit sexual immoralities, what kind of world would we live in? It would be unbelievable. No locks. Lock companies would be out of jobs, right? You wouldn't have to worry about investing your money with people. Why? Because they would never steal from you. You wouldn't have to worry about the Madoffs of the world or anybody else that's going to rob you because you make certain investments. No. You know why? Because they're looking out for your good. And that's really the story. So if we look at the 7 laws, don't look at them as this thing of not bringing about perfection to the individual. But I do want to bring a point up, and this is a point that Michael Dallin makes in his book. It's called, of course, the Rainbow Covenant, Torah and the 7 Universal Laws. And on page 66, he makes a interesting observation based on some texts in the Tanakh. One's from the book of Eob, the book of Job, and the other one's from the book of Malachi. But he says, in relationship to the 7 laws, he says, there's more. As you go deeper into this study, you will encounter the following remarkable principle. And here's a principle that you run into. No one is virtuous unless he goes so far as to do the very opposite of what the Noahide Laws forbid. Now, if you take that, in other words, what is going to really make us virtuous? Now, we're not commanded, but you have to think about it in this sense. I have a prohibition against idolatry, okay? Now, nowhere in the 7 laws do I have a positive admonition that tells me I should worship God. Right? But it's very obvious from the prohibition against worshiping other gods, that I would have to follow the positive aspect of worshiping the one true God.
Right.
And of course, involved in that, by the way, would be a great study of developing true and correct ideas about who God is, or maybe about who God is not.
Right.
So, for most of us, that would be a lifetime study of just trying to understand that we are to worship this one God, a God that we can't see, that we can't touch, that we can't put our arms around and hug and have all these gushy, nice, emotional feelings about it, but a God that we can learn about, and that He's gave us enough information about Himself that it can bring us to the point that we desire to worship Him, that we desire to love Him, that we desire to do the right thing.
Right.
Right? So, even though we don't have this commandment that says you shall worship, right? Israel has such a commandment, but we don't. But we do.
It seems to be inherent within the prohibition.
Exactly. Because if I'm prohibited from worshiping the other God, then it's quite obvious.
You have to recognize and worship the only God.
I have to recognize and worship the only God there is, right? There's an interesting passage. If you'll hold that for just a minute, I'd like to find this and just read it to you. When Solomon was dedicating the temple of God, as in his dedication, of course this is in the book of 1 Kings, when he was dedicating the temple, he makes some amazing statements, especially in relationship to the non-Jew, by the way, right? And this is in 1 Kings 8, and he begins in, let's see, okay, verse 41. And he's talking about coming to the temple and praying, right? Mm-hmm. And he says, moreover, concerning a stranger, a ger, right? And then he says, that is not of thy people Israel. Now he gets really specific, right? So we have a ger, he's a stranger. But he wants us to know this individual is not part of Israel.
Which would not be a convert.
No, he's not a convert.
Because if you're a convert, then you are part of Israel.
Right. He's just a stranger, right? Not a convert, not of the people of Israel. But he cometh out of a far country for thy name's sake. And that's an interesting statement, for thy name's sake. Mm-hmm. Why? I mean, the obvious question you should, well, why are they coming for his name's sake? For they shall hear of thy great name, and of thy strong hand, and of thy stretched out arm, which these are all anthropomorphic terms, right? Strong hand, of his omnipotence, his might, of his stretched out arm, his ability to save, and not soteriologically, but to rescue people, to deliver people, right? Because what happens, of course, in Egypt, everybody hears about that, right? And it says, when he shall come and pray toward this house, the temple, this is Solomon, King Solomon, he says, hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger called to thee for, that all the people of the earth, all peoples, right, may know thy name, to fear thee as do thy people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have been built is called by thy name.
Right, and anybody who is a true student, and they start investigating the name of the Creator,
yes,
the Almighty, blessed be He, when they start studying that, they're going to find something very interesting.
Absolutely.
That name is a unique name.
Exactly.
That name is not one that should be thrown around lightly.
No.
Not even in different translations. That's a name that only has 4 consonants. And the people of the world need to start seeking that name so that they can start realizing what they're missing.
And by the way, part of the name, is not just the name, but it's all these things that are attached to the name. You know,
Exactly.
It's like, say, I know Hiram, and so when somebody comes up to me and says, "You know Hiram Vasquez?" "Oh yeah, I know Hiram." And all of a sudden, kind of in my mind, I get a facial recognition of who that is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they could just say Hiram, and I say, "Wait a minute, which Hiram are you talking about?" Maybe there's more than one Hiram. But then we get more specific, and then I say, "Okay, I know Hiram." And all of a sudden, I remember Hiram's mannerisms. I know how he acts. And that's really you. It's not your name per se, but that's really you.
Mm-hmm.
So the Eternal One, right, has certain actions that we attribute to that name. In other words, He's loving, right? He is kind. Mm-hmm. He is merciful. Yes, He is just, and He's righteous. That we assign to that name. Mm-hmm. So when we start thinking about the name, all that becomes just attached to Him.
Right, but Solomon was trying to convey a message.
Yes.
And that's the interesting point to me, is that people tend to not see the message in his words. And he's speaking about the temple. There's only one temple.
Exactly.
There's not many, like people think.
He's talking about the temple that he dedicated in Mount Moriah, right, in Jerusalem. But the interesting part, I think, that he also says that God would hear him in heaven. Right? He prays toward the temple, but God would hear him in heaven, and that God would answer his prayer. But the important part is so that he would learn to fear that name just as Israel fears.
Exactly.
Okay? So all of a sudden this thing about, okay, there's this prohibition against idolatry, but all of a sudden it turns around to a positive of worshiping, but not just worshiping any God, but worshiping the right God. Right? So Israel, has maintained this idea of a strict monotheistic idea, and has declared to us through that name, right, these things about God that we can know, and that we can rest assured that these are identified with that God, and all of a sudden now we can worship that God. Why? Because now we begin to know that God. He's not only, if you look at it another way, here is this stranger, maybe he's came from a far land that we're worshiping other gods.
Right.
And he's been praying to them all this time.
Didn't that happen?
and he's been praying to these other gods all this time, and nothing ever happens.
Right.
Right? No answer. and all of a sudden he comes to the temple. Now you understand why Solomon says, God, you hear him in heaven, and you answer his prayer. Right? So, why? So that he will know that you are the one true God, the God that he can pray to, the God that actually does answer prayer, right?
Well, he even expands that to the whole world, the whole people of the world.
Exactly.
Like for the sake of recognizing that.
Exactly. And so eventually he wants everybody to come to fear Hashem just as the people of Israel fear Hashem. If we look at the prohibition against blasphemy, for example, which means that we shouldn't talk bad about the Creator,
then what do we do in opposite?
We sanctify the name. Right? What does it mean to sanctify the name? It means, well, number one, we just don't talk bad about him. But if we sanctify the name, it means we actually talk well about him, good about him. And we want to tell people, in deference and difference to some people, that the God of what people call the Old Testament is a loving, kind God. I think people have this idea that he's this mean, vindictive God, that he's telling people to go kill these people and do this and do that, you know. Don't get me wrong, I can't explain the ways of God and God's justice system. That's him. That's left up to him. It's not left up to me. But I can tell you that God of the Torah, the God of the Torah, is a God of compassion, a God of love, and a God of mercy. And for us to ever think that he's anything else, we have truly blasphemed the name of God. But in our sense of violating that word, by the way, is we should sanctify his name. Constantly we should be talking about him. We should be proclaiming his name in all of its goodness and kindness and justice. But understand that all those things that we're talking about are one and the same within him. They're not broken up into segments. So if I say that God is love, for example, it tends to limit him to that's all he is. But he's much, much more than that.
Well, it's a representation that he's the source
of love.
Of love.
Right.
Everything, he's the source for everything that we know of. Without him, there would not be anything else.
Right. For example, we wouldn't even be able to define what love is without him telling us what love is all about. Mm-hmm. So that's the other part. The other part is, if we're looking toward being really virtuous, then don't blaspheme his name. In fact, sanctify his name in every way that you can. And there's many, many ways. I mean, there's a whole lifetime of study of just learning ways to sanctify his name. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we could come to the prohibition against murder, mm-hmm. right? Well, what's the opposite of that? Mm-hmm. The opposite of that is that we should be trying, to the best of our God-given ability, to preserve life. And let me point out, not just human life, mm-hmm. but life in general. I always remember this great story was told about this rabbi and his son was walking one day on the Sabbath. And as they walked, maybe it wasn't on the Sabbath, but they were walking along and they were having this conversation. And the son just kind of nonchalantly reaches up and plucks a leaf off of a tree. And his father stops and gives him a little reprimand, but explains to him that tree, that leaf, is a living thing. And for his son, just arbitrarily, without thinking about it, to reach up and to pluck that leaf off of that tree was like taking a life in some sense. Now, if you really think about it in the long-term sense, what does that leaf do? That leaf is a living thing.
And it's part of the ecosystem.
And it's part of the system. The system is that this leaf breathes in carbon dioxide. And what does it breathe out?
Oxygen.
It breathes out oxygen. What do we breathe in? Oxygen. What do we breathe out? Carbon dioxide. So in some sense, we're connected to that leaf in a very unique way. Mm-hmm. Well, what if people just carelessly plucked every leaf in the world away? Or look at what's going on, with the destruction of the rainforest in different parts of the world, mm-hmm. Which, number one, is doing away with all kinds of unique plants and unique animals, mm-hmm. That might have all kinds of cures, by the way, because mm-hmm. most of the cures for human beings actually come from plants or animals. From nature itself. At the same time, but it's wiping out how much oxygen these plants put back into the system that's breathing in all this carbon dioxide that we're putting out into the world.
It actually seems to be designed in a give and take format.
Yes.
So everything that we take, we are supposed to replenish.
Exactly. So, if
otherwise Adam wouldn't have been given the order to make sure that he,
keeps the garden.
Keeps the garden
exactly.
and all that stuff.
You got to keep the garden. It's the same, by the way, keeping the garden is the same ecological word that's in Hebrew to ecologize, to ecologize the world or the earth. Mm-hmm. But that's part of our job too, is to preserve life as best we can. Now, a lot of people brings up certain issues. What could I do this and could I do this? You have to look at it as, okay, if that thing has life, and it does, then where does my life intrude into that thing's life? Now that becomes a different issue, but what we wanted to point out was, especially in the fact of murder, which is a prohibition against taking life, what would be the opposite of that is preserving life. Mm-hmm. And whether it be a human life or plant life or animal life, whatever kind of life it is, yes, it might be a lower form of life, but we have an obligation
To preserve it.
To preserve it, whatever it is. Then we could go to the prohibition against theft. And I think this is one that you can really point things out, right? The prohibition against theft. If we don't steal, now that's a good thing, and that's a certain level of perfection. But there's a greater perfection that can come out of that prohibition, and that's doing the opposite of it. Now, by the way, all I'm saying is we're not commanded. Don't get me wrong. We're not commanded. But just to look at the 7, there's a realization that there's another side to it, just as Michael points out in his book. There are other virtues. So even though I'm not commanded to give charity, right? Mm-hmm. But there is this problem back in the book of Genesis with Sodom and Gomorrah. Even though, they're living under the Noahide Laws system at that time, and by the way, ignorance is, you can't claim ignorance on this. Now, what we do find out is that here is a group of people that God finally extinguishes from the face of the earth. And a lot of people will say, oh, it's because they were into all kinds of sexual sins, there were places full of homosexuals. Well, that's a sin, don't get me wrong. And there probably were some of those types of people that lived in that area. I'm not saying they're not. But when we really get down to it and we find out who is really, what is the sin that these people did that deserved the death penalty? In other words, what was this sin that they did that was so great that God decided that these people no longer were allowed to live on the face of the earth, right? That they had gone against everything. And what we find in the book of Ezekiel, one of the great prophets of God, right? He identifies exactly what was going on with this group of people at that time. And Ezekiel says, here was a people that were sated with bread. Now, what means sated? They had plenty of bread. They had plenty of everything. But the one thing they didn't have plenty of, and that was charity. They were not a charitable people. And because they were not a charitable people, that is why God ultimately destroys these people. Now, is there a commandment for them to be charitable? Well, among the 7, we don't find one.
Not directly spelled out.
Not directly spelled out. And let me point out also, too, this wasn't necessarily a violation of a law, but it was a violation of a moral issue. Mm-hmm. Right? A moral issue. Because when Hashem came down and saw what was going on in this place, they were doing evil in the sight of Hashem. It was a moral issue. And the moral issue was they were not a charitable people. So if we want to be a virtuous people, right? It's not just that we don't steal, but we actually turn around and become givers. That we are a charitable people. We never want to fall prey like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah in those cities that actually lived by the rule of law. Mm-hmm. But it was their laws that they had made that actually allowed them to steal from people and not be charitable. Mm-hmm. It was just the opposite of that. And so they lived in this really wealthy place. It was, as the Bible tells us, it was a well-watered plain. In other words, it was a place where you could have a lot of flocks. You could probably grow a lot of crops, a really beautiful, lush place, and had pretty much anything they wanted, but they were not going to share that with anyone. And so they basically made laws that prevented strangers from staying there. When strangers did come in, they actually had laws that would allow them to steal a certain amount without being brought before the court system. So everybody in the town would steal just that certain amount. They would make sure that they only stole that little bit of amount. And therefore they couldn't be put under any kind of justice system. Why? Because they were within the law. But again, all these laws prevented the really main factor was that they were not kind, they were not compassionate, they were not charitable.
They were self-gratifying laws when they implemented.
very selfish. We would say they probably fit what we call today, and you hear this term, many terms today in our society as being narcissistic. They were a narcissistic society. They were a society that loved themselves, only cared for themselves, and of course eventually brings the wrath of God down upon themselves because of that. So even though these people didn't have a commandment to do chesed, to do compassion and kindness and charity, we do find that they're judged for a lack of it. Right? So that's kind of interesting. So if we take that prohibition against theft, right, then we have to say, okay, what is the opposite of theft? What can really impact my life? What can make me a better individual? What perfection can I gain? You know, okay, I got a little perfection here because I'm not stealing from someone, but the real perfection is the other side. The real perfection for the individual is that now he becomes a charitable person. Not to the point that he just gives, but he actually loves to give. There's a great book, by the way, it's a little small book. It's called Ahala Hesed, and it's written by the Kopetz Chaim. It's based on the passage in the book of Micah, chapter 6, where God says, "Oh man, I have told you," you know, in other words, I've already gave you instruction, what you should do, what is good, what is righteous, right? He says to keep God's justice, to keep, you know, the judgments of God, to keep His justice. Yes, that's part of it. But then he says something interesting. He says, but you should also love chesed. You should love compassion and kindness and tzedakah. Those are traits that you should really love. So, you know, if we're not going to steal, and that's a good trait, by the way, but not just stealing is not going to fulfill the vacant virtue that we are expected as a human being, as becoming a real Adam, a real perfected human being. So as Michael says in his book, and I'm glad you have a place here, I want to read this again. He says, there's more, and he's talking about the 7 laws. As you go deeper into the study, you will encounter the following remarkable principle. No one is virtuous unless he goes so far as to do the very opposite of whatever the Noahide Laws forbid. He says a man excuse me, cannot fully satisfy the Noahide Law against larceny, for instance, unless he gives charity. The Noahide Law against profaning God's name unless he acts to sanctify the name. The Noahide Law against murder unless he acts to save the life of the person in danger, etc., etc. So, again, it's back to the fact that these ideas of virtues, this idea of working toward perfection, is not just in the fact that I don't do anything, right? Okay, I'll give you an example. And you can answer this one, okay? So, I happen to swing by your house one day and I see you running around your house. And there's a guy chasing you, right? And I see him with a gun or an instrument of death in his hand. And this guy's really angry. And I can hear him yelling, when I catch you, I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to cut you up in little pieces. I'm going to make sure that every bit of life is drained out of you. And I say to myself, well, you know, I wish Hiram good luck. It's not me that's going to murder him, right? I'm just going to drive him down the road. And I hope Hiram can defend himself and somehow get this gun or this axe or whatever this guy has away from him. I hope he can really defend himself. And I just get in my car and casually drive him down the road. Now, have I violated the prohibition against murder? No. I'm not the guy that's doing the murdering.
Right.
But on the other hand, do I have a responsibility to ensure that your life is preserved? You think so?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, why would you let somebody else commit murder?
Ah. So all of a sudden now, because if I'm not the murderer, then I'm fulfilling the part of the law, right? I'm not partaking in murder. But if I allow somebody to take your life, am I still guilty of anything?
Morally, yeah. Guilty by moral association.
So now we're in a real quandary here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've kept the law. I'm not violating the law. Okay, let's ask another question. What if I have to go to the extreme recourse? If I see this actually happen, I understand this gentleman's about trying to take your life, and what if I have to go to the extreme recourse of actually taking this individual's life to prevent him from taking your life? Am I guilty of murder?
The definition of murder must be given.
Well, murder is, we know, something that's actually somebody has sat down, they have meticulously planned out
A kill.
To kill an individual.
Right.
Okay? But I have an obligation to preserve life.
Mm-hmm.
And if it means taking somebody else's life,
Who is trying to commit murder,
I still have an obligation to preserve life. Yeah. Right? So these issues are not always as black and white as what people say.
There is gray in the middle.
There is gray in the middle. There's really not, in some sense, because if I understand, okay, I'm not killing Hiram, so therefore, I'm not violating the prohibition against murder. I'm not out there actively involved in taking this man's life, so I'm okay with it, and I can just drive off and say, oh, well, I pray to Hashem that Hiram can fend this guy off and he doesn't kill him, Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I also have this obligation to preserve life, even if it means having to take the life of an individual that is trying to take the life of another individual. Seems kind of strange, but that's the way the laws work, right? So I'm not to murder, but can I prevent somebody else from being murdered? Yes. Even to the extreme recourse of having to take that individual's life. Now, if I had a gun in the car, okay, and I jumped out, and if I saw the opportunity to just shoot this guy in the leg, mm-hmm. right, and that would prevent him from taking your life. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's what I should do. Mm-hmm. But if the only recourse I have is to take this individual's life, then that is the course of action that I have to take. Mm-hmm. Right? So like I said, as we communicate about these laws, they're not always what I call face value. Right? There's always exceptions. There's always ways of understanding. And so when somebody goes through these laws, sometimes they say, okay, I got the laws. Don't do this, don't do this, don't. I can do that. Can you?
Well, the don't is the arbitrary way of saying just don't do it, like you would tell your child.
Exactly.
But at the same time, the don't should lead to knowing what to do. Because my child, if I tell my child, I don't want you to do that, so what is my child supposed to do?
Exactly. Right. Exactly. And that usually has to come as a follow-up. Children, first of all, have to be told what not to do. And then, of course, as they get older and their mind develops more, then you can give more information. But when we talk about the 7 laws, they're much, much more in detail and in greater depth than just the 7 laws. So if we look at the 7 and we think, okay, I'm prohibited from idolatry. And now what does that mean when I have a prohibition against idolatry? It means I'm prohibited from worshiping any other God. Mm-hmm. I have to follow that up and say, other than the one true God. I can't stop and say I just have a prohibition against idolatry, because when my question becomes in my mind, what does it mean to have a prohibition against idolatry? It means that I cannot worship any other God other than the only God.
Otherwise, if it were not something that we were responsible for, why would we have been given idolatry to begin with? Exactly. Because if the nations didn't have that same responsibility, of worshiping the only God, then there will be no point for God to even bother them in having to recognize Him.
Well, and the other point I want to bring up too was the fact that the passage that I read from 1 Kings 8, starting verse 41 and following, was that this individual comes to the temple of Hashem and he prays, and God answers him based on what King Solomon says. And one of the greatest wise men in the world, by the way, and he understands exactly what he's doing when he makes his dedicatorial prayer. And God answers him. Why? So that he would learn to fear Hashem. That he would learn to fear Hashem just as Israel does. In other words, this great respect for that name. Just as Israel has great respect for that name. Right? And of course all those things that are attached to that name. You know, those things that we talked about before. But we have to start back and say, okay, if it's a prohibition against this, there's a reason why. But we have to have a great lengthy explanation. So I can't just say I'm prohibited from idolatry. Yes, that is my prohibition, but when I start asking, what does it mean to practice idolatry? The practice of idolatry means to worship anything other than the one true God. So therefore, automatically I say, wait a minute, then I need to worship the one true God.
Yeah, that would be the do part.
That's the do part. It's the other opposite side of it. And it's the same way with blasphemy. You know, if I'm prohibited against blaspheming God's name, then I want to find out, well, first of all, what does it mean to blaspheme God's name? And as I'm studying through what it means to blaspheme God's name, well, I'm going to find out that it's the opposite of sanctification of God's name. So if I'm sanctifying God's name, you know what I'll never do? I'll never blaspheme. If I'm worshiping the one true God, I'll never commit idolatry. And this is why it's important that we study all these laws in their details, in the depths of their details. And all of a sudden we come like, whoa, wait a minute. This is totally amazing.
Right, exactly. Because that's where the proactive and reactive part comes in of what I was trying to say last time. And if we can go back to that, you said that, you know, it's the part that we have to do, right? So the proactive part, the way I look at it is, the proactive part is that which helps you learn how to overcome so that you don't become reactive. Modern law is set up to be reactive.
Exactly.
You wait for somebody to do something before you can charge them with anything.
Exactly.
Before you can even stop them.
Right.
Okay? It doesn't fix the problem. It only prolongs it. And it doesn't help people grow because it's not making the point come across that when a law is being broken, it's being broken. It's bad.
Exactly.
Okay? So it's reactive. It's doing nothing. Okay? Other than trying to deal with people after they've done something.
Exactly. Instead
of teaching people, giving them the means and giving them the self-empowerment to become better and to do right by themselves and others. So this is the interesting thing about the Torah. The Torah, when it's talking about laws, is a means for mankind to be able to generate proper perspective of how they're supposed to act. And what that does is that it becomes proactive towards themselves and others around them. So if you know that a sin is what God has already detailed in the Bible, okay? He says that, you know, sin would be you committing theft. So you know that's a sin, right? So what do you want to do? You want to be proactive and not being able to commit that sin. Whereas in modern law, in our current government, a thief who hears that that theft is wrong, don't steal. If they get caught for stealing your next door store, something from there, they're going to get put in jail. Okay, they're not thinking of it in that format that, okay, it's wrong, how do I avoid it? They're thinking it's wrong according to law, so how do I circumvent it?
How do I not get caught?
Right. So what they're supposed to be doing when you understand and have a connection with God is that modern law can take that same perspective, is that it becomes proactive for the individual. And if they started teaching this to everybody that's breaking the laws instead of just punishing them, they might be able to see a difference. But I know everyone has free will. They're going to want to do what they want to. But this is the perspective that mankind is supposed to have. The proactive perspective. How do you keep yourself from doing things that you know are wrong? And there's not that devil made me do it clause that you can actually proclaim, because, you know, it's Satan. And Satan is within every human being. Satan is that which will cause you to break the law. Satan is the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination of man. That which, you know, causes you to prove yourself, so to speak, to whether you will follow God's ways or not. So if you want to get, you know, esoteric, it would be an angel placed by God for you to have to prove yourself that you really love God. So that's the point of proactive that I was trying to get to, is that we study the laws so that we know what sin is, so that we know what government law prohibits. Because if you look at government law, it's basically modeled under what God says you can't do.
In some ways,
some ways.
Yes.
So, you know, humanity in large, if they all put their efforts to knowing about why do we have laws, what are they for, how do they help us, what are we supposed to get from it in respect of, you know, us doing our part. But nobody wants to think this way. And then they wonder why things don't get better. You know, who's that? John Mayer, I think is his name. He says, you know, waiting for the world to change. It's like, hell, why don't you just make a change? You know, do your part. If you already got your heart right with God, do your part. Change it. You know, don't waste time.
Well, I know we're probably getting pretty short on time here, but and we need to get finished, but we would like to continue this discussion. And in reality, we want to talk about, you know, the benefits, and this is the side that most people lose sight of. The beneficial parts of keeping the laws, not only as a society, but as individuals. And when people understand the benefits that outweigh, you know, this negative idea we can't keep those laws. You can keep those laws. That's the reality. You can keep those laws. But to teach people to keep laws is, first of all, to educate them in the fact of the benefits. And it's kind of a selfish idea, but it's okay to begin with. Teach them the benefits that they will receive as an individual by everyone complying with these laws. And then teach them the benefits that everyone within that society, within that community, within that town, within that nation that receives benefits by everyone complying with the law. As long as they are not, of course, violating any kind of God's laws, they're going to be beneficial for human beings. So when we talk about the seven, let's look at it. Okay, they're negative, but there are benefits that come about because of those. And if we look at the positive side of that negative, then they become much, much more clearer as to the benefits they bring to humanity.
And they're supposed to be, you know, when you study on this, so that you can learn your weak area, so that you can strengthen yourself, and you can overcome, you know, your weaknesses.
Certain weaknesses. Yeah. But that's the perfection we're talking about. It's not becoming perfect, but it's working toward that ultimate goal of perfecting yourself as much as your God-given abilities allow you to. And the way you do that is study Torah, right? And like I said, you can spend your lifetime learning the idea of the one true God, you know, the true concepts and the true beliefs of the one true God. I mean, you could spend a lifetime doing that. And of course, the second one, blasphemy, you know, learning how to sanctify His name, to speak well of Him, to speak kindly of Him, and don't allow other people to speak badly of Him. So hopefully, as we continue, we'll talk about these things also.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I hope you guys enjoyed it. And you'll probably see us get more heated and more emotional. Because to me, you know, when I came to this learning, it taught me so many things that I took for granted before. So many things that I even disavowed at one point in my life. And the only thing that kept me going in my life, the only thing that I kept going in my life was wondering about God. Wondering about, there has to be, this could not have happened haphazardly. Like some people think that it was coincidental.
Order doesn't come out of chaos.
So, that was the only thing that stuck with me, and it has brought me to where I'm at today. I know I've made mistakes in the past, but that's just it. You're a human being. You're going to make mistakes. Don't you think God would have given a way for you not to have that problem? To me, that's what made me question. That's what made me dig deeper. And that's really the issue, is that He has given the message. He has given the word. 2,000 years of covering that message have to be blanketed out now.
Yes.
I'm speaking bluntly now.
Yes.
And it will come to pass. Prophecy says that no matter what, the world will know God's name the way Israel does.
Yes.
They will worship God the way Israel does, not the other way around.
Exactly.
So with that, I'll leave you. Hope you will come back. And please feel free to leave comments. Don't be hateful. If you got something to say, use your mind. Use your abilities that God gave you. Speak clearly. Let us know. We want to hear. And if you want to talk about it, we'll talk about it. We don't have a problem with it. That's the way you generate conversation. That's the way you get through hurdles. You become smart individuals. You learn together, and you can put aside differences for the moment, just for the sake of learning truth. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.